She extended her hand across the polished conference table, a simple gesture of professional respect. The chairwoman looked at it, then at her, and refused. One sentence. One moment of calculated contempt. By sunrise, $2.4 billion would vanish, and an empire built over decades would crumble into dust. Welcome back, everyone. I'm so glad you're here. If you're new or just haven't yet, please subscribe and like this video, it makes a huge difference. And I'd love to connect with you, so drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. Your support keeps this channel going strong. Now, let's jump into today's story. The elevator doors opened onto the 47th floor with a whisper of expensive machinery, revealing a corridor that screamed old money and older prejudices. Ava Monroe stepped out, her navy Armani suit catching the late afternoon light that poured through floor-to-ceiling windows. Her heels made confident clicks against the polished stone, each step a declaration that she belonged here, that she had earned her place at this table through brilliance, not birthright. Behind her, two members of her team followed, James Chen, her sharp-eyed CFO who could smell a bad deal from 3 states away, and Rebecca Torres, her legal counsel who had memorized every comma of the merger contract they were about to finalize. This wasn't just another business meeting. This was the deal, the one that would cement Monroe Capital's position as one of the most formidable investment firms on the East Coast. $2.4 billion. That's what her firm was bringing to Sloan Industries, a manufacturing conglomerate that had dominated the industrial sector for 60 years but had recently hit rough waters. They needed Monroe Capital's investment to modernize, to compete, to survive. Ava had spent 6 months conducting due diligence, negotiating terms, and ensuring that this partnership would be mutually beneficial. Every number had been scrutinized. Every clause had been debated. Every contingency had been planned for. Almost every contingency. The receptionist, a blonde woman whose smile didn't quite reach her eyes, gestured toward the conference room. "They're ready for you, Ms. Monroe." Ava nodded her thanks and pushed open the heavy wooden doors, entering a space that looked like it had been designed to intimidate. The conference table was massive, surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's cars. Paintings of stern-faced white men in suits lined the walls, former chairmen, no doubt, each one seeming to glare down at anyone who dared enter their sanctum. 12 people were already seated around the table. Ava recognized most of them from video conferences and preliminary meetings. There was Gerald Whitmore, Sloan's CFO, a nervous man with thinning hair who had been surprisingly easy to work with. Beside him sat Thomas Kincaid, the COO, whose military background showed in his rigid posture. Various board members, vice presidents, and department heads filled the other seats, their faces a mixture of anticipation and thinly veiled skepticism. And at the head of the table sat Victoria Sloan. The chairwoman was 73 years old, but she wore her age like armor. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun that matched her severe expression. Diamond studs glittered in her ears, not ostentatious, just expensive enough to remind everyone of their place. She wore a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than Ava's entire outfit, and she sat in her chair like it was a throne, surveying her domain with the cold calculation of someone who had never been told no in her entire life. Victoria's eyes tracked Ava as she entered, a flicker of something, surprise, displeasure, crossing her face before being masked by professional neutrality. But Ava had built her career on reading people, on seeing the micro-expressions that revealed truth beneath polite veneers. She saw it, the slight tightening around Victoria's mouth, the almost imperceptible straightening of her spine, the way her fingers drummed once against the table before stilling. "Ms. Monroe," Victoria said, her voice cool and measured. "You're right on time." The words were polite. The tone was not. "Punctuality is respect," Ava replied smoothly, moving toward the empty chairs reserved for her team. "Thank you for accommodating our schedule." As her team settled in, Ava noticed something odd. There was a camera mounted in the corner of the room, a professional setup with a small red light indicating it was active. This hadn't been mentioned in any of their previous discussions. She glanced at Rebecca, who had noticed it too and was already making a note on her tablet. "I see we're being recorded," Ava said, keeping her tone casual. "That wasn't part of our agreed protocol." Victoria waved a dismissive hand. "Standard procedure for all major transactions. Surely Monroe Capital does the same." "With prior notice and consent, yes. Consider yourself noticed." Victoria's smile was thin. "Now, shall we begin? I'm sure you're eager to finalize this arrangement and return to," she paused, her eyes sweeping over Ava with barely concealed condescension, "wherever it is you operate from." The insult was subtle but unmistakable. Ava had offices in 3 cities, including one just blocks from where they sat, but Victoria was implying something else entirely. That Ava was an outsider. That she didn't belong in this world of generational wealth and inherited power. James shifted uncomfortably beside her. Rebecca's pen stopped mid-note. Several of the Sloan executives suddenly found their papers fascinating. Ava smiled. Not a warm smile, a professional one, the kind she'd perfected over years of dealing with people who underestimated her because of her skin color, her gender, or both. "Monroe Capital operates globally, Mrs. Sloan. But today, we're here. Shall we review the terms?" For the next 40 minutes, they went through the contract page by page. The deal was structured as a strategic investment. Monroe Capital would inject $2.4 billion into Sloan Industries in exchange for a significant equity stake and board representation. The money would fund a complete digital transformation, new manufacturing facilities, and an expansion into emerging markets. In return, Ava's firm would see substantial returns over the next decade while Sloan Industries would regain its competitive edge. It was a good deal. A brilliant deal, actually. Ava had structured it so that both parties won. But something was off. Victoria kept making small comments, nothing overtly hostile, but each one carrying a barb. When Ava suggested a timeline for the technology upgrades, Victoria remarked that some people are more comfortable with modern systems than others. When discussing board appointments, she noted that tradition and experience matter in these positions. Each comment was followed by agreeable murmurs from several board members, the kind of people who had learned to echo their leaders' sentiments. Gerald, the CFO, seemed increasingly uncomfortable. Thomas, the COO, kept his expression carefully neutral. But others around the table, particularly the older board members, watched with barely concealed amusement, as if they were enjoying a private joke. The live stream camera hummed quietly in the corner, its red light unwavering. Finally, they reached the signature page. This was it, the moment 6 months of work would culminate. Ava pulled out her fountain pen, a gift from her father when she'd founded Monroe Capital 12 years ago. She'd used it to sign every major deal since. "Before we proceed," she said, standing and moving around the table toward Victoria, "I'd like to thank you for this partnership. I believe Sloan Industries and Monroe Capital will accomplish remarkable things together." She extended her hand across the space between them. Victoria looked at Ava's outstretched hand. Then she looked at Ava's face. Then, deliberately, slowly, she leaned back in her chair and folded her arms across her chest. "I don't think that will be necessary," Victoria said, her voice carrying clearly in the suddenly silent room. The silence that followed Victoria's refusal stretched like pulled wire, tension vibrating through every molecule of air in the room. Ava's hand remained extended for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for everyone present to understand what had happened, short enough to maintain her dignity. She lowered it slowly, her expression unchanged, though her mind was already calculating, cataloging, planning. James had gone completely still beside her, his face flushed with barely contained anger. Rebecca's fingers had frozen over her tablet. Around the table, reactions varied. Gerald looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. Thomas's jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly. The older board members, particularly Harrison Webb and Patricia Greenfield, exchanged glances that held something dangerously close to satisfaction. Victoria, however, wasn't finished. You must understand, Ms. Monroe, she said, each word precisely enunciated, that Sloan Industries has maintained certain standards for over 6 decades. We've built our reputation on discretion, on propriety, on knowing exactly who we do business with. She paused, letting her gaze travel slowly from Ava's face down to her shoes and back up again. We simply want to ensure that our new partners understand the culture they're entering. The word partners landed like a slap. The way Victoria said it, with that slight pause, that subtle emphasis, made it clear she considered the term aspirational at best. Your culture, Ava repeated, her voice perfectly level. She moved back to her seat, but she didn't sit. Instead, she stood behind her chair, her hands resting lightly on the leather back. Tell me, Mrs. Sloane, what exactly does that culture entail? Excellence, Victoria said immediately. Integrity. A certain pedigree, if you will. My grandfather founded this company in 1964. My father expanded it across the country. I've spent 30 years at the helm, maintaining the standards they established. We don't just accept anyone's money, Ms. Monroe. We partner with firms that reflect our values. There it was. The gauntlet thrown so precisely that Victoria could deny any accusation of impropriety while everyone in the room knew exactly what she meant. Ava had encountered this particular brand of prejudice before, the kind that hid behind words like culture, and standards, and tradition, the kind that could be defended in court while everyone knew the truth. But Victoria had made a critical error. She'd said it in front of witnesses. She'd said it on camera. And she'd said it to someone who had spent 12 years building an empire specifically designed to withstand attacks from people exactly like her. I see, Ava said quietly. She glanced at Rebecca, who gave the slightest nod. She'd caught it too. Every word, every gesture, captured by that camera Victoria herself had insisted on using. And does your firm's legal team agree with this assessment? A man Ava hadn't noticed before, young, maybe 35, with the pale, strained look of someone who knew disaster when he saw it approaching, half rose from his seat at the far end of the table. Mrs. Sloane, perhaps we should. Nathan, sit down. Victoria didn't even look at him. Ms. Monroe, I'm simply being honest with you. Surely you appreciate honesty in business dealings? I do, Ava said. Which is why I'll be honest with you. I've spent 6 months conducting due diligence on Sloan Industries. 6 months reviewing your financials, your operations, your market position. Do you know what I found? She didn't wait for an answer. I found a company hemorrhaging money because your manufacturing processes are 20 years out of date. I found a workforce demoralized by poor management and worse leadership. I found contracts being lost to competitors who've embraced innovation while you've clung to tradition. I found a company on the brink of irrelevance, being held together by the reputation your grandfather and father built, a reputation you're systematically destroying through arrogance and incompetence. Gerald had gone pale. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. Thomas's expression remained carefully neutral, but Ava caught the flash of something in his eyes, agreement, perhaps, or vindication. Victoria's face had turned to stone. How dare you? I'm not finished. Ava's voice cut through the room like a blade, quiet but absolute. That $2.4 billion you need so desperately. That's not just capital. That's Monroe Capital's reputation. That's 12 years of perfect investment returns. That's relationships with every major bank, every significant pension fund, and every sovereign wealth manager who matters. And you think you can sit in your leather chair and insult me? You think you can refuse to shake my hand and question my pedigree? She paused, letting the words sink in. Mrs. Sloane, I don't need you. You need me. And right now, I'm trying to decide whether Sloan Industries is worth saving, or whether I should let the market finish what your pride started. The red light on the camera continued blinking, recording every word, every moment, every unforgivable second of what would soon be known as the beginning of the end. Victoria Sloane had not built an empire, or rather, maintained one, by backing down. She rose from her chair with the slow deliberation of someone who believed the room would always bend to her will, her hands pressed flat against the polished wood of the conference table. "You forget yourself, Ms. Monroe," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "This is not some startup negotiation where passion and theatrics win the day. This is Sloan Industries. We have survived recessions, market crashes, and competitors far more formidable than your boutique investment firm." She practically spat the last 3 words. "If you think you can waltz in here and dictate terms to me, you're even more delusional than I suspected." Around the table, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. Patricia Greenfield nodded approvingly. Harrison Webb's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. But Gerald looked like he might be sick, and Nathan, the young lawyer, had his head in his hands. "Mrs. Sloane," Thomas said carefully, speaking for the first time since the meeting began, "perhaps we should take a brief recess to—" "We will do no such thing." Victoria's gaze hadn't left Ava's face. "Ms. Monroe is going to sit down, we are going to sign this contract, and she is going to learn that in this world, there are still hierarchies that matter. There are still people who understand their place. Their place." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. James made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a growl. Rebecca's hand moved to her phone, fingers flying across the screen. And Ava simply stood there, absorbing every word, every gesture, every devastating piece of evidence that Victoria was too arrogant to realize she was providing. "You know what fascinates me about this moment?" Ava said, her voice conversational now, almost gentle. "6 months ago, when your CFO first approached Monroe Capital, you were desperate. Your quarterly reports were disasters. Your stock price was in free fall. 3 of your largest clients had terminated their contracts. The banks were calling in loans. You needed a savior, and Gerald was smart enough to find one." Gerald flinched at the mention of his name. Victoria's eyes narrowed dangerously. "We negotiated in good faith," Ava continued. "We agreed to terms that were generous, some might say too generous, to Sloan Industries. We structured this deal to give you time to recover, to modernize, to compete. And I told my partners at Monroe Capital that despite the risks, despite the red flags, Sloan Industries was worth saving because of its legacy, its workforce, its potential." She walked slowly around the table, not toward Victoria, but toward the window. The city spread out below them, Manhattan in all its brutal, beautiful glory. 47 floors down, people were living their lives, unaware that in this glass tower, an empire was about to crumble. "But I made sure to protect Monroe Capital," Ava said, still looking out the window. "Because I've learned, Mrs. Sloane, that in this world, you need insurance against people who mistake courtesy for weakness. People who think respect is something they can withhold based on the color of someone's skin or the length of their family tree." She turned back to face the room. "Rebecca, would you please read Clause 8.3 of our agreement?" Rebecca didn't need to look at the contract. She'd memorized every word. Clause 8.3, Immediate Withdrawal Provision. Monroe Capital reserves the right to withdraw all committed funding immediately and without penalty if documented evidence of discrimination, ethical misconduct, or material misrepresentation is presented during the execution phase of this agreement. Withdrawal shall be executed within 30 minutes of such documentation, with all funds reverting to Monroe Capital's control. The words landed like bombs. Gerald's face went from pale to gray. Nathan's head snapped up, his eyes wide with horror. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, as if saying a prayer for something already lost. Victoria laughed. Actually laughed, a cold, brittle sound. "You're bluffing. You wouldn't dare walk away from a deal this size over a refused handshake. Your firm's reputation would be destroyed." "Documented evidence," Ava repeated softly. Her eyes moved to the camera in the corner, its red light still blinking faithfully. "You insisted on recording this meeting, Mrs. Sloane. Standard procedure, you said. And I have witnesses, 12 of them, in fact, who just watched you refuse to shake my hand, question my pedigree, and tell me to know my place. The color finally drained from Victoria's face. You wouldn't. Rebecca, Ava said calmly, please send the documentation to our legal team and the board of Monroe Capital. James, contact the bank. Tell them to prepare for immediate fund withdrawal. Authorization code, Omega 77 Black. James pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from something that looked dangerously close to joy. Wait, Victoria's voice cracked. You can't. I already have. The first phone buzzed at exactly 4:47 p.m. It was Gerald's, a sharp, insistent vibration against the conference table that made everyone jump. He grabbed it, looked at the screen, and his face transformed from gray to white in the space of a heartbeat. Oh God, he whispered. Then Harrison's phone went off. Then Patricia's. Then 3 more simultaneously, creating a discordant symphony of alerts, buzzes, and ringtones that shattered what remained of the meeting's facade of control. Even Victoria's phone, an expensive model that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, began vibrating insistently in her Hermes bag. Thomas reached for his phone with steady hands, but Ava watched his expression change as he read whatever message had arrived. He looked up at Victoria, and for the first time since Ava had entered the room, she saw something other than military discipline in his face. She saw fear. The markets, he said quietly. Victoria, the markets are reacting. Reacting to what? Victoria snapped, but her voice had lost its imperious edge. She was reaching for her own phone now, her perfectly manicured fingers fumbling slightly with the clasp of her bag. Ava remained standing by the window, her own phone silent in her hand. She'd already known what was coming. She'd triggered it herself 3 minutes ago with a single authorization code, a failsafe she'd built into every major deal Monroe Capital had ever made. Protection against exactly this kind of situation. Rebecca had moved to stand beside her, tablet in hand, tracking the cascade of events that Ava had set in motion. Bloomberg just posted the alert, she murmured, angling the screen so only Ava could see. Sloan Industries merger deal withdrawn. Monroe Capital cites material misconduct. Stock price already down 7% and falling. 7% in 3 minutes. That was just the beginning. Gerald had stood up, his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand gesturing frantically at nothing. Yes, I understand, no, I don't know, we're still in the meeting. He looked at Victoria with something close to panic. It's the exchange. They're asking for a statement. Trading has been halted pending clarification of our financial position. What? Victoria's phone had finally emerged from her bag, and she was staring at it like it had betrayed her. That's impossible. The deal hasn't even been, she stopped, understanding finally dawning in her eyes. She looked at Ava. What have you done? I executed a clause we both signed, Ava said simply. A clause your legal team approved. A clause that exists specifically to protect investors from situations exactly like this one. Nathan, the young lawyer, had his laptop open now, his fingers flying across the keyboard. She's right, he said, his voice hollow. Clause 8.3 is ironclad. I reviewed it myself. I told you, he stopped, looking at Victoria. I told you 3 months ago that we needed to be careful about this provision. That Monroe Capital had built-in protections we'd never seen before. And I told you, Victoria hissed, that no clause matters if the deal is good for both parties. That we had nothing to worry about because we weren't planning to discriminate or engage in misconduct. Her voice dripped with sarcasm on those last 2 words. But you did, James said, speaking up for the first time since Victoria had refused Ava's handshake. His voice was steady, professional, but there was steel underneath. You discriminated. You engaged in misconduct. And you did it on camera, in front of witnesses, during the execution phase of a $2.4 billion transaction. Mrs. Sloan, with all due respect, you just committed the most expensive mistake in your company's history. More phones were buzzing now. Patricia had stood up, her own device pressed to her ear, her face a mask of controlled panic. Harrison was frantically typing messages, his earlier smugness replaced by something that looked like terror. Around the table, the Sloan Industries executives were beginning to understand that they weren't just witnessing a failed negotiation. They were witnessing a catastrophe. Victoria's phone rang, an actual call, not just a text or alert. She answered it with a shaking hand. Yes. A pause. I don't, another pause, longer this time. The color continued draining from her face until she looked almost translucent in the late afternoon light. How much? She lowered the phone slowly, staring at nothing. Our stock, she whispered. It's down 18%. In 5 minutes. 18%. Ava checked her own phone. Rebecca was right, the news had spread faster than wildfire. Bloomberg, Reuters, CNBC, the Financial Times, every major financial outlet was running some version of the same story. Monroe Capital withdraws $2.4 billion from Sloan Industries deal, citing discrimination. Sloan Industries stock plummets after merger collapse. CEO Ava Monroe pulls funding following alleged misconduct. And because Victoria had insisted on live streaming the meeting, because she'd wanted documentation of her triumph, the footage was already being analyzed, clipped, and shared. Twitter was exploding with clips of Victoria refusing Ava's handshake. LinkedIn was on fire with comments from industry leaders. In the ruthless world of high finance, blood was in the water, and the sharks were circling. Mrs. Sloan, Gerald said, his voice cracking, the banks are calling. They want to know about our liquidity position without Monroe Capital's funding. They want to know if we can cover our obligations. Victoria didn't answer. She was still staring at her phone, watching her empire dissolve in real time. The chaos in the conference room had evolved from shocked silence to barely controlled pandemonium. Patricia Greenfield had abandoned all pretense of composure and was shouting into her phone about protecting her personal investment portfolio. Harrison Webb had actually left the room entirely. Ava had watched him slip out 2 minutes ago, probably to call his own financial advisors before the contagion spread to his other holdings. Gerald was now on his third phone call, each one seemingly worse than the last. Sweat had begun to bead on his forehead despite the aggressive air conditioning. No, we cannot confirm our cash position at this time. Yes, I understand you need answers. Thomas had moved to Victoria's side, speaking to her in low, urgent tones. Ava couldn't hear the words, but she could read the body language. He was trying to salvage something, anything, from the wreckage. But Victoria just stood there, frozen, her phone hanging limply in her hand. James leaned close to Ava. The wire transfer is complete. All $2.4 billion has been returned to Monroe Capital's primary accounts. The bank has confirmed receipt and security. Ava nodded. The money was safe. More importantly, Monroe Capital's reputation was intact, would be enhanced, actually, once the full story came out. She'd protected her firm, her investors, and her integrity with a single, surgical strike. This was what power looked like when wielded with precision. Rebecca was monitoring social media now, her tablet scrolling through an endless stream of reactions. It's everywhere, she murmured. The video clip has been shared over 50,000 times in the last 8 minutes. #handshake collapse is trending globally. CNN is calling it a watershed moment in corporate accountability. The handshake collapse. Ava filed that away. History would remember this moment, would study it in business schools, would use it as a case study in what happened when arrogance met consequences. Nathan, the young lawyer, had approached their side of the table, his movements hesitant. Ms. Monroe, he said quietly, for what it's worth, I tried to warn her. 3 months ago, when I reviewed the contract, I specifically flagged Clause 8.3. I told her it was unlike anything I'd seen before, that it gave you unprecedented power to withdraw if certain conditions were met. And what did she say? Ava asked, though she could guess. She said, Nathan swallowed hard. She said that clause would never matter because Sloan Industries doesn't engage in discrimination or misconduct. She said I was being paranoid. She said. He trailed off, looking back at Victoria, who was still standing motionless at the head of the table. She said people like you should be grateful for opportunities like this. People like you. There it was, the poison that had infected this entire organization, flowing down from the top. Victoria Sloan hadn't just refused a handshake. She'd revealed a culture of prejudice so deeply embedded that her own lawyer had tried to warn her and been dismissed. You should start looking for a new job, Ava said, not unkindly. Sloan Industries won't survive this. Nathan nodded slowly. I know. We're going to lose more than half our market value by market close tomorrow. The banks will call in their loans. Our clients will invoke termination clauses. Our best employees will jump ship to competitors. He looked at her with something like awe mixed with horror. You've destroyed the company in less than 10 minutes. No, Ava corrected gently. Victoria Sloan destroyed this company the moment she decided her prejudice was more important than her fiduciary duty. I just documented it. Gerald's voice suddenly rose above the general chaos. They're asking about bankruptcy protection. The board wants to know if we should file for Chapter 11. Bankruptcy. The word landed like a guillotine blade. Several board members who'd been frantically working their phones stopped and stared at Gerald. Even Victoria seemed to emerge from her trance, her head turning slowly toward her CFO. We're not, she started, but her voice cracked. We can't be. Mrs. Sloan, Gerald said, and there was no respect in his voice anymore, only exhausted rage. We just lost $2.4 billion in funding that we've already committed to spending. We've promised our suppliers, our contractors, and our manufacturing partners that we'd have this capital. We've signed contracts based on Monroe Capital's investment. And now it's gone, and our stock price is in free fall, and every creditor we have is going to demand immediate payment because they'll think we're insolvent. He slammed his phone down on the table. We are insolvent. As of right now, Sloan Industries cannot meet its financial obligations. We are, for all practical purposes, bankrupt. The room fell silent. Even the phone seemed to stop buzzing for a moment, as if the universe itself was pausing to acknowledge the magnitude of the disaster. Victoria Sloan, chairwoman of Sloan Industries, 73 years old, heir to a 60-year legacy, turned to look at Ava Monroe. And for the first time since they'd met, Ava saw something other than arrogance in those eyes. She saw understanding. She saw the awful recognition of a mistake that could never be undone. You've destroyed everything, Victoria whispered. 60 years of history. Thousands of jobs. My family's legacy. All because of a handshake. Ava picked up her briefcase, preparing to leave. Rebecca and James had already gathered their materials. There was nothing left to do here. The collapse would continue with or without their presence. But she paused at the door and turned back. No, Mrs. Sloan, she said quietly. All because you thought respect was optional. The elevator descent from the 47th floor felt longer than the ascent, though the numbers clicked downward at the same mechanical pace. Ava stood in the center of the car, Rebecca and James flanking her like an honor guard. None of them spoke. There was nothing that needed to be said, not yet, anyway. The debriefing would come later, in the safety of Monroe Capital's offices, where they could dissect every moment of what had just transpired. James's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then at Ava. It started. CNBC is running a breaking news segment. They're calling it the fastest corporate collapse in modern history. 23 minutes, Rebecca said, checking her watch. From handshake refusal to bankruptcy discussion in 23 minutes. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby, a cavernous space with soaring ceilings and imported stone that probably cost more than a small country's GDP. A security guard glanced up from his desk, then quickly looked away. Word had already spread. The lobby, which had been bustling with well-dressed executives when they'd arrived, was now eerily quiet. People clustered in small groups, whispering, their phones out, their faces shocked. As Ava and her team crossed toward the exit, she caught fragments of conversation. Refused to shake her hand, can you believe? The entire investment, just gone. Stock price is down 26% now. My pension fund has Sloan Holdings, oh God. The revolving doors spun them out onto the street, where the late afternoon had turned golden and indifferent. Manhattan continued its relentless pace, oblivious to the fact that an empire had just crumbled in the tower behind them. Taxis honked. Pedestrians rushed past. A street vendor sold pretzels on the corner, calling out prices. But as they walked toward their car, a sleek black town car with Monroe Capital's discreet logo on the door, Ava noticed phones turning toward them. A young woman in a business suit did a double take, then quickly lifted her phone to snap a picture. Two men in expensive suits stopped their conversation to stare. A delivery driver actually paused mid-step, his mouth falling open in recognition. The video had gone viral. Ava's face was now one of the most recognizable in the country, perhaps the world. By tomorrow morning, she'd be on every news channel, every talk show, every podcast. The woman who'd brought down a corporate giant with a single, calm decision. Ms. Monroe. A voice called out. They turned to see a young reporter jogging toward them, a cameraman struggling to keep up. Ms. Monroe, can you comment on what happened at Sloan Industries? Is it true you withdrew $2.4 billion over a refused handshake? Their driver had already opened the car door, but Ava paused. This was the moment that would define the narrative. She could get in the car, refuse to comment, let the story write itself. Or she could take control of it. She turned to face the camera, her posture relaxed, her expression calm. What happened today at Sloan Industries wasn't about a handshake, she said, her voice clear and measured. It was about respect, accountability, and the legal protections that every investor has the right to invoke when faced with discrimination. Monroe Capital entered that meeting in good faith, prepared to finalize a partnership that would have benefited everyone involved. Instead, we documented behavior that violated not just basic human decency, but the specific terms of our agreement. The reporter thrust her microphone closer. But some are saying your response was extreme, that you've destroyed thousands of jobs over a personal slight. Ava had expected this. The narrative was already forming, sensitive CEO overreacts, destroys company out of spite. She'd seen it before, directed at women and people of color who dared to demand respect in corporate spaces. The whispers that they were too emotional, too aggressive, unable to separate personal feelings from business decisions. Victoria Sloan destroyed those jobs, Ava said firmly. Not me. When you lead a company, when you hold the trust of thousands of employees and investors, you have a responsibility to act with integrity. Mrs. Sloan chose to violate that trust in a documented, public forum. The consequences of that choice are hers to bear, not mine. What message do you hope this sends? Ava looked directly into the camera, knowing that this clip would be played and replayed, analyzed and discussed, for years to come. That respect isn't negotiable. That discrimination has consequences. And that in 2024, there are people with the power and the will to enforce accountability, no matter how wealthy, how established, or how protected the offender thinks they are. She paused. The old boys club is closing. And those who refuse to evolve will find themselves on the outside looking in. Now here's something for you to think about. If you had the power to hold someone accountable for discrimination in such a decisive way, would you use it, even knowing thousands of innocent people might be affected? What's more important, immediate justice or protecting those caught in the crossfire? Drop your thoughts in the comments. The reporter looked stunned, as if she hadn't expected such a direct, uncompromising response. Ava didn't wait for follow-up questions. She slid into the car, Rebecca and James following, and the door closed on the growing crowd of onlookers and cameras. As the car pulled away from the curb, James let out a long breath. That was perfect. Absolutely perfect. You just controlled the entire narrative in 90 seconds. It needed to be said, Ava replied, watching the Sloan Industries building recede through the rear window. 47 floors up, Victoria was probably still standing in that conference room, watching her world disintegrate. And it needed to be said by me, in my words, before anyone else could twist it. Rebecca was already typing on her tablet. Social media response is overwhelmingly positive. The clip is already being shared. Hashtag respect isn't negotiable is trending alongside hashtag handshake collapse. She looked up. Ava, you've become a symbol. A symbol. That's what happened when private moments became public spectacles, when individual actions crystallized into movements. Ava hadn't set out to become a symbol. She'd simply built protections into her contracts and enforced them when necessary. But the world was hungry for accountability, desperate for examples of power being checked, and she just provided one. Her phone rang, her personal line, the number only a handful of people had. She glanced at the screen, Director Chen, her mentor and one of Monroe Capital's founding board members. Director, she answered. Ava. His voice was warm, proud. I just watched what happened. All of it. The meeting, the withdrawal, your statement to the press. I have to tell you, in 40 years of finance, I've never seen anything like it. I did what the contract allowed. You did what was right, he corrected. And you did it perfectly. The board is meeting in an hour, but I can already tell you the consensus, full support. Every partner, every investor, every stakeholder is behind you. Monroe Capital's reputation hasn't been damaged, it's been enhanced. We're already receiving calls from firms wanting to work with us, wanting protections like Clause 8.3 in their own deals. Ava closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself a moment of relief. She'd been confident in her decision, but confidence wasn't certainty. The support of her board and her partners meant everything. Thank you, Director. No, Ava. Thank you. You've reminded the world that integrity isn't just a word we put in mission statements. It's a line we defend, no matter the cost. By the time Ava reached Monroe Capital's offices in Midtown, the sun had begun its descent, painting the city in shades of amber and shadow. The building, a sleek glass tower that reflected the sky like a mirror, had become a destination. News vans lined the street outside. Reporters clustered near the entrance, their cameras trained on the revolving doors. Security had already been doubled, men and women in dark suits creating a perimeter that kept the media at bay while allowing employees to pass through. The crowd recognized her car immediately. Cameras swiveled, reporters surged forward against the security line, voices calling out questions that blurred together into an incomprehensible wall of sound. But the security team was professional, creating a clear path from the curb to the entrance. Ava walked through it with her head high, acknowledging no one, answering nothing. There would be time for more statements later. Right now, she needed to be with her team. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor was mercifully quiet, just her, Rebecca, and James, each lost in their own thoughts about what the next hours and days would bring. When the doors opened, they were greeted by applause. The entire Monroe Capital staff, analysts, associates, partners, assistants, everyone, had gathered in the main reception area. They stood in clusters, their faces alight with something Ava hadn't expected to see, pride. Not just professional satisfaction, but genuine, personal pride. Maria Santos, one of their senior analysts and a black woman who'd been with the firm for 7 years, was the first to approach. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Thank you, she said simply. Thank you for doing what so many of us have wished we could do but never had the power to accomplish. Others echoed the sentiment, forming a receiving line Ava hadn't asked for but found herself moving through. Young associates who'd faced their own discrimination in business school. Partners who'd been passed over for promotions at other firms because of their gender or race or accent. Administrative staff who'd been invisible in boardrooms despite their intelligence and competence. You showed them, said Trevor Hughes, a junior analyst. You showed them we're not to be dismissed or disrespected. You protected all of us, added Keisha Williams, one of their legal counsels. Every clause we negotiate from now on will have teeth because of what you did today. Director Chen emerged from the crowd, his silver hair gleaming under the office lights. At 71, he'd seen every iteration of Wall Street's evolution, from the paper trading days to the algorithm-driven present. He'd founded Monroe Capital with two other partners 30 years ago, had brought Ava on as an analyst 12 years back when she was fresh out of Harvard Business School with more ambition than connections. Conference room, he said quietly. The board is assembled. Ava nodded, following him through the maze of offices and cubicles toward the executive wing. Rebecca and James peeled off to debrief their own teams while Ava prepared for what would likely be a long evening of strategic planning. The conference room was smaller than Sloan Industries' grotesque display of wealth, but infinitely more sophisticated. Clean lines, minimalist design, technology seamlessly integrated into every surface. The 7 members of Monroe Capital's board of directors were already seated, their tablets and laptops arrayed before them like instruments of war. They stood as Ava entered, a sign of respect that felt particularly poignant after the afternoon's events. She took her seat at the head of the table, and they followed suit. Let's begin with the facts, Director Chen said, pulling up a presentation on the main screen. As of 6:15 p.m. Eastern Time, Sloan Industries' stock price has fallen 38% from its opening position. Trading was halted twice for volatility. Their market capitalization has decreased by approximately $1.9 billion in less than 3 hours. The numbers appeared on screen, red arrows pointing downward with devastating clarity. Their credit rating has been downgraded to junk status by 2 major agencies, with more expected to follow. 3 of their largest creditors have issued demand letters for immediate payment. 2 major clients have already announced they're seeking alternative suppliers. And their CFO, Gerald Whitmore, submitted his resignation 40 minutes ago. Gerald was the smart one, Ava murmured. He saw the ship sinking and jumped. Indeed, said Sandra Okonkwo, another board member and one of the few Nigerian-American women to reach partner level at a major investment firm. But let's discuss Monroe Capital's position. Ava, you've become the most talked about person in finance today. Our phone system has been overwhelmed with calls, from investors wanting to work with us, from companies requesting our services, from media outlets requesting interviews. She pulled up another slide showing a staggering list of names: Fortune 500 companies, sovereign wealth funds, pension managers, private equity firms. All wanting a piece of Monroe Capital, all wanting to be associated with the firm that had stood up to discrimination. Our preliminary analysis suggests we could see a 20 to 30% increase in assets under management within the next quarter, Sandra continued. Purely based on today's events and the reputation they've generated. That's not why I did it, Ava said quietly. We know, Director Chen replied. But that doesn't change the reality. You've positioned Monroe Capital as the firm with integrity, the firm that protects its principles even at potential cost. In an industry where trust is currency, that's invaluable. Robert Steinberg, the firm's operations director, leaned forward. However, we need to discuss the potential backlash. There are already op-eds being written, some praising you, others criticizing the decision as heavy-handed. Some are framing this as an attack on traditional business structures. Others are questioning whether one person should have the power to destroy a company so quickly. Let them question, said Jennifer Park, the youngest board member at 42. The contract was clear. The clause was legal. The misconduct was documented. Anyone criticizing Ava's decision is essentially arguing that discrimination should be tolerated if the financial stakes are high enough. Which is exactly the argument we need to confront head-on, Director Chen said. Ava, you'll be receiving interview requests from every major outlet. We need a media strategy. We need talking points. And we need to be prepared for Victoria Sloan's counter-narrative. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Sandra's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and her eyebrows rose. Speaking of Victoria, she's just released a statement. The room fell silent as Sandra pulled up the statement on the main screen. Today, Monroe Capital made a reckless and disproportionate decision that will harm thousands of innocent employees and investors. What Ms. Monroe characterizes as accountability was in fact a misunderstanding blown out of proportion for publicity purposes. Sloan Industries has served this country with distinction for 60 years, and we will not allow one person's oversensitivity to destroy that legacy. We are exploring all legal options and remain committed to our stakeholders. The word oversensitivity hung in the air like poison gas. She actually used that word. James, who'd slipped into the room during the reading, said in disbelief. After everything that happened, after being caught on camera, she's doubling down. She has no choice, Ava said, reading the statement again. Admitting fault means admitting liability. Her lawyers probably wrote this, trying to salvage something. But that word, oversensitivity, that's going to destroy her. Why? Asked Robert, who despite his years in finance sometimes missed the social nuances. Because it's exactly what people like Victoria always say when they're called out for discrimination, Ava explained. It's the last refuge of someone who knows they're wrong but refuses to admit it. And the public, especially now, in this moment, is tired of hearing it. She was right. Within minutes, social media erupted with response to Victoria's statement. The hashtag #NotOversensitive began trending, filled with stories from people, mostly women and people of color, who'd been told they were too sensitive when reporting discrimination or harassment. Victoria's attempt at damage control had instead poured gasoline on the fire. Director Chen stood, moving to the window that overlooked the city. Somewhere out there, 47 floors up in another glass tower, Victoria Sloan was watching her world end. And here, in this room, a new chapter was being written. Ava, he said, turning back to face her, you need to understand something. What you did today, it's bigger than one contract, bigger than one company. You've drawn a line in the sand. And now everyone in finance, everyone in corporate America, is watching to see what happens next. Are you ready for that? Ava thought about her father, who'd worked 3 jobs to put her through college. Her mother, who'd faced discrimination her entire nursing career but never had the power to fight back. The countless professionals of color who'd been dismissed, disrespected, and told to be grateful for whatever scraps they were given. I've been ready my entire life, she said. The war room, that's what they started calling Monroe Capital's main conference area by hour 6 of the crisis management session, had taken on the atmosphere of a military command center. Laptops covered every surface, displaying live feeds from financial networks, social media analytics, legal databases, and market data. Coffee cups multiplied like rabbits. Someone had ordered food that sat mostly untouched on a side table. It was nearly midnight when the real bombshell dropped. Jennifer Park, who'd been monitoring the legal situation, suddenly sat upright, her face draining of color. Oh my God! Everyone turned to look at her. Sloan Industries just filed an emergency lawsuit, she said, her voice tight. They're suing Monroe Capital and Ava personally for $5 billion in damages. They're claiming, she scrolled rapidly through the document on her screen, breach of contract, defamation, tortious interference with business relationships, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The room erupted. $5 billion. More than twice what Monroe Capital had withdrawn. It was a staggering number, clearly designed to intimidate, to shift the narrative, to make Ava look like the aggressor rather than the victim of discrimination. They filed at 11:47 p.m., Jennifer continued. Probably hoping to control the morning news cycle. The complaint alleges that Ava, maliciously and without justification, destroyed Sloan Industries for personal and political purposes rather than legitimate business reasons. Let me see that, Rebecca said, moving to read over Jennifer's shoulder. Her eyes scanned the legal document with the speed of someone who'd spent years parsing dense contracts. This is garbage. Pure intimidation tactics. Every allegation is contradicted by the video evidence and the contract terms. Doesn't matter if it's garbage, Robert said grimly. The lawsuit itself becomes the story. Sloan Industries fights back, files $5 billion lawsuit against CEO who destroyed company. That's the headline that'll run on every outlet tomorrow morning. Director Chen had remained quiet throughout the discussion, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his expression thoughtful. Now he spoke, his voice calm despite the chaos swirling around them. They're desperate, he said simply. This lawsuit isn't about winning. It's about survival. Victoria needs to change the narrative from racist chairwoman destroys own company to victimized business fights back against aggressive investor. She needs her board, her creditors, her employees to believe she's fighting, not capitulating. It's also about scaring other companies, Ava added, seeing the strategy clearly now. If this lawsuit gains traction, if we're tied up in litigation for years, other executives will think twice before invoking similar clauses. They'll worry about the legal costs, the personal exposure, the years of depositions and court appearances. Exactly, Sandra said. This isn't just about Sloan Industries anymore. This is about whether discrimination clauses have real teeth or whether they can be nullified through aggressive litigation. Ava stood, pacing to the window. The city sprawled below, its lights twinkling in the darkness like a galaxy. Somewhere in that constellation of lives and dreams and struggles, people were watching this unfold, choosing sides, forming opinions about who was right and who was wrong. Her phone buzzed, a text from her mother in Atlanta, "Baby, I'm watching the news. They're saying terrible things. Are you okay? Do you need me to come up there?" Ava smiled despite everything. Her mother, who'd spent 40 years as a nurse being called "girl" by patients and doctors half her age, who'd smiled through 1,000 microaggressions because she couldn't afford to lose her job, was ready to fly to New York to protect her daughter. She texted back, "I'm fine, Mom. Better than fine. I love you." "We fight," Ava said, turning back to the room. "We don't settle. We don't apologize. We take this to trial if necessary, and we win. It'll cost millions in legal fees," Robert warned. "Years of your time. Depositions, discovery, media scrutiny. They'll dig into every aspect of your life, every business decision you've ever made, looking for ammunition." "Let them dig," Ava said. "I've built Monroe Capital with integrity. Every deal, every contract, every relationship, clean. They won't find anything because there's nothing to find. They'll make things up," James said quietly. "Twist facts, take quotes out of context, paint you as the villain. That's what people like Victoria Sloan do when they're cornered. Then we'll correct the record. Every time. As many times as it takes." Director Chen was nodding slowly, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You know what this reminds me of? When Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on that bus. People told her she should have just moved, that fighting wasn't worth the trouble, that she was being unnecessarily difficult. But she understood something they didn't." He stood, moving to join Ava at the window. She understood that some battles aren't about convenience or cost. They're about drawing lines that should never have needed to be drawn in the first place. Lines that say, this far, no further. Human dignity is not negotiable. Sandra pulled up another screen, this one showing polling data that had been conducted in the hours since the incident. "For what it's worth, public opinion is overwhelmingly on your side, Ava. 73% support your decision. 81% believe Victoria Sloan's behavior was discriminatory. Even among conservative business leaders, 60% say you were justified. Numbers can shift," Jennifer cautioned. "Especially once Sloan's legal team starts their media campaign. They'll find sympathetic voices, people who'll argue about job losses, about the sanctity of contracts, about whether one moment of rudeness justifies destroying a company." "Then we make our case better," Rebecca said. We show that this wasn't one moment. We pull every complaint ever filed against Sloan Industries, employment discrimination, supplier disputes, client concerns. We demonstrate a pattern of behavior, not an isolated incident. We also, Ava added, a new thought forming, reach out to Sloan's employees. The ones who've experienced Victoria's management firsthand. The ones who've seen the culture of discrimination that flows from the top. We give them a platform to share their stories. It was a risk, opening the floodgates to employee testimonies could go unpredictably. But Ava had read the company culture in that boardroom. She'd seen the discomfort on Gerald's face, the resignation in Thomas's eyes, the horror in young Nathan's expression. There were people at Sloan Industries who knew exactly what kind of leader Victoria was. "I have a contact," Thomas said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at him in confusion before realizing he'd slipped into the room at some point during the discussion. Thomas Kincaid, Sloan's COO, standing in Monroe Capital's war room at midnight. "Mr. Kincaid," Director Chen said carefully. "This is unexpected." "I resigned an hour ago," Thomas said, his military bearing evident even in his exhaustion. "Sent my letter to the board, effective immediately. I've spent 15 years at Sloan Industries, watched it decline under Victoria's leadership, watched good people leave because of the toxic culture she created. And tonight, watching her try to destroy you for having the courage to hold her accountable, I couldn't stay silent anymore." He pulled out a flash drive from his jacket pocket. "This contains documentation of every discrimination complaint filed internally at Sloan Industries over the past 10 years. Every lawsuit that was settled quietly with NDAs. Every executive who left after experiencing or witnessing misconduct. Victoria thinks she can bury this under litigation and PR spin. But the truth needs to come out." Ava looked at the flash drive, then at Thomas. "If you provide this, you'll be targeted too. Sloan's lawyers will come after you for breach of confidentiality, theft of proprietary information, anything they can think of." "I know," Thomas said simply. "I'm ready for that fight. Some things matter more than a career." Rebecca took the flash drive, her hands reverent, as if she were handling sacred text. In a way, she was. This was evidence that could dismantle Victoria's entire defense, could prove that today's incident wasn't an aberration but a symptom of systemic rot. "The war just changed," Sandra said softly. "They wanted to make this about one handshake, one moment, one oversensitive CEO. Now it's about decades of discrimination, documented and undeniable." Ava looked around the room at her team, her board, her colleagues, her allies. They were tired, running on caffeine and adrenaline, but there was something else in their faces too. Determination. Purpose. The recognition that they were part of something larger than a business deal gone wrong. "We're not just defending Monroe Capital anymore," she said. "We're defending everyone who's ever been told their dignity doesn't matter as much as a powerful person's comfort. Everyone who's been dismissed, disrespected, and told to accept it with a smile." She looked at Thomas, at the flash drive in Rebecca's hands, at the data streaming across dozens of screens. "Let them bring their $5 billion lawsuit. Let them bring their legal army and their PR machine and their narrative spin. We have something they don't." "What's that?" Robert asked. "The truth," Ava said. "And it's cheaper than their lawyers." 3 months later, the Manhattan courthouse steps had become a stage for history. Ava stood at the top, flanked by her legal team, facing a sea of cameras, reporters, and supporters that stretched down the block. The morning sun cast long shadows across the granite, and somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed 9 times, the hour when Victoria Sloan's $5 billion lawsuit had been scheduled for its first major hearing. It would never take place. Behind her, through the imposing courthouse doors, lawyers for both sides had just concluded an emergency settlement conference. Not because Monroe Capital had wavered, but because Sloan Industries, what remained of it, no longer had the resources or the credibility to continue the fight. The 3 months since the handshake collapse had been brutal and transformative. Thomas's flash drive had contained dynamite, 43 documented complaints of discrimination spanning a decade, 17 confidential settlements totaling $8.3 million, emails from Victoria explicitly instructing HR to find reasons to terminate employees who didn't fit the Sloan culture, and testimony from dozens of former executives about a toxic environment where prejudice flowed from the very top. The media had devoured it. What began as a story about one refused handshake had evolved into a comprehensive investigation of corporate discrimination. 60 Minutes had run a special. The New York Times had published a devastating exposé. Former Sloan employees had begun speaking out, their NDAs challenged in court and many overturned. The #handshake collapse had transformed into a broader reckoning about workplace discrimination and accountability. Sloan Industries hadn't survived the scrutiny. Their stock, which had plummeted 38% on that first day, had continued its death spiral. Major clients had terminated contracts. Key employees had defected to competitors. 3 creditor banks had foreclosed on loans. By week 6, Sloan Industries had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. By week 10, they were in liquidation proceedings, their assets being sold off piece by piece to satisfy debts. Victoria Sloan herself had been forced to resign as chairwoman after a unanimous vote by the remaining board members. Her personal wealth, considerable though it was, had been decimated by legal fees, settlements, and the collapse of her stock holdings. The woman who'd refused to shake Ava's hand now found herself toxic in business circles, her calls unreturned, her reputation in tatters. And this morning, her lawyers had capitulated. Rebecca stepped forward to the microphone array that had been set up on the courthouse steps. Her voice was clear and firm, carrying across the crowd and into the cameras that would broadcast this moment globally. This morning, attorneys for Victoria Sloan and the bankruptcy estate of Sloan Industries formally withdrew all claims against Ava Monroe and Monroe Capital. In addition, they have issued a formal apology acknowledging that Ms. Monroe's actions were legally justified and that the discrimination she experienced was real, documented, and unacceptable. No settlement was paid by Monroe Capital. We did not compromise. We did not negotiate. We simply stood firm on the truth. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Reporters shouted questions, but Rebecca continued. Furthermore, as part of the bankruptcy proceedings, a fund has been established to compensate Sloan Industries employees who lost their jobs. Monroe Capital has voluntarily contributed $50 million to this fund, not because we caused these job losses, but because we believe in supporting workers who suffer when leadership fails them. That had been Ava's idea. She'd faced criticism throughout this ordeal about the employees who'd lost their jobs when Sloan collapsed. The argument that she'd been too harsh, too uncompromising, that she should have found a way to punish Victoria without destroying the company. It was an argument Ava rejected. Victoria had destroyed the company through years of mismanagement and discrimination, but she also recognized that innocent people had suffered. The $50 million wouldn't make everyone whole, but it would help. And more importantly, it made a statement: accountability for leaders didn't mean abandonment of workers. Now it was Ava's turn. She stepped to the microphones, feeling the weight of thousands of eyes, millions watching via live stream. This moment would define her legacy, would be quoted and studied and debated for years to come. She'd prepared remarks, but standing here now, she set aside the notes. 3 months ago, I walked into a meeting prepared to finalize a partnership, she began. I extended my hand in a gesture of professional respect, and it was refused. In that moment, I had a choice: accept the disrespect, complete the deal, and normalize the behavior, or enforce the protections I'd built into our contract specifically for situations like this. She paused, letting the words settle. Some have called my response extreme. They've argued that one moment of rudeness didn't justify destroying a company. But here's what they misunderstand: this was never about one moment. It was about a culture of discrimination that had existed for years, that had harmed countless employees, that had cost people their careers and dignity. The handshake wasn't the problem, it was the symptom. A woman in the crowd, one of the former Sloan employees who'd testified about discrimination, nodded vigorously, tears streaming down her face. What I learned over these past 3 months, Ava continued, is that Sloan Industries wasn't destroyed by my decision to withdraw funding. It was destroyed by years of toxic leadership that valued pedigree over performance, that confused tradition with prejudice, that believed certain people deserved respect while others needed to earn it through silence and submission. She looked directly into the main camera, knowing that Victoria, wherever she was, would likely be watching. To everyone who has ever been dismissed, disrespected, or discriminated against in a professional setting, your dignity matters. Your humanity matters. And increasingly, there are protections, there are allies, and there are consequences for those who think your respect is optional. The crowd erupted in applause. Reporters shouted questions all at once, creating an incomprehensible wall of sound. But Ava held up a hand, because she wasn't finished. I also want to address the Sloan Industries employees who lost their jobs. I know many of you are angry, at Victoria, at the situation, perhaps at me. I understand that anger. You deserved better leadership. You deserved a company that valued integrity over arrogance. While I stand by my decision to enforce our contract terms, I also recognize that you paid a price for someone else's failures. The $50 million employee fund is a small gesture, but it comes with a larger promise. Monroe Capital is hiring. We're expanding our operations, and we're specifically reaching out to former Sloan employees whose careers were disrupted through no fault of their own. This was the other announcement, one that had been kept quiet until this moment. Monroe Capital had spent the past month preparing to absorb dozens of Sloan's displaced workers, particularly those from diverse backgrounds who'd thrived despite the toxic culture. We're not just talking about accountability, Ava said. We're building something better. A business environment where respect is foundational, where diversity is strength, where the old gatekeepers no longer control who gets a seat at the table. She stepped back from the microphones, and the crowd surged forward with questions. But her team had already formed a protective circle, guiding her toward the waiting car. There would be more interviews, more statements, more opportunities to shape the narrative. But the core message had been delivered. As the car pulled away from the courthouse, Ava finally allowed herself to exhale. Rebecca sat beside her, tablet already displaying the social media response, overwhelmingly positive, hashtags trending, clips of her speech being shared thousands of times per minute. You did it, Rebecca said quietly. You actually changed the game. Had she? Ava wasn't sure one case, one victory, could change an entire system built on centuries of discrimination and inequality. But it was a crack in the foundation. A proof of concept. A message to every boardroom, every executive, every person who thought power insulated them from consequences. Her phone buzzed, a text from Director Chen, the board wants to see you. Good news. 20 minutes later, Ava sat in Monroe Capital's conference room, facing the 7 board members who'd supported her through the entire ordeal. Director Chen was smiling, which was unusual enough to make Ava nervous. We've been approached by 12 different companies, he said without preamble. All of them want Monroe Capital to structure their investment deals with similar protection clauses. They want what they're calling the Monroe Clauses, provisions that allow for immediate withdrawal if discrimination or misconduct is documented. 12 companies. Ava repeated. Fortune 500 companies, Sandra clarified. Including 3 that specifically requested you personally oversee the contract negotiations. Ava, you've created a new standard in corporate accountability. Companies want to prove they're serious about inclusion by accepting these terms. It's becoming a mark of legitimacy. There's more, Jennifer added. We've had inquiries from institutional investors, pension funds, endowments, sovereign wealth funds, who want to invest in Monroe Capital specifically because of how you handled this situation. Our assets under management have increased 47% in 3 months. The numbers were staggering. Monroe Capital had been successful before, but this was a different level entirely. They were becoming not just an investment firm, but a symbol, proof that integrity and profitability weren't mutually exclusive. And one more thing, Director Chen said, pulling up a document on the main screen. The business school at Harvard, your alma mater, wants to create a case study about the handshake collapse. They want to teach future business leaders about the importance of building protections into contracts, about enforcing ethical standards, about the real cost of discrimination. Ava stared at the proposal. Her story, her decision, her 3-month ordeal, would be taught to the next generation of business leaders. Students would analyze what she'd done, debate whether it was right, learn from both the strategy and the outcome. There's a question they want answered in the case study, Director Chen continued. What does Ava Monroe believe she accomplished beyond the immediate business outcome? How would you answer that? Ava thought about Victoria Sloan, probably sitting in some expensive apartment, her empire reduced to rubble, her reputation destroyed. She thought about the former Sloan employees who'd shared their stories of discrimination, finally feeling heard. She thought about the young professionals of color who'd sent her messages saying she'd inspired them to demand better treatment. She thought about the companies now racing to implement their own accountability clauses. I proved something, she said finally. I proved that respect isn't a courtesy you extend when it's convenient. It's a requirement you enforce when it's challenged. I proved that power concentrated in the wrong hands will eventually be checked by power distributed to the right ones. And I proved that the old excuse, that discrimination is just the cost of doing business, is no longer acceptable. She stood, moving to the window that overlooked Manhattan. The city sprawled below, full of boardrooms and conference tables and negotiations and deals. In some of those rooms, people were being disrespected right now. Being dismissed, being discriminated against, being told their dignity mattered less than someone else's comfort. But now, at least, there was a blueprint for fighting back. A clause that could be written into contracts. A precedent that could be cited in negotiations. A story that could be told to prove that accountability was possible. Respect is cheaper than recovery, Ava said, repeating the words she'd spoken to Victoria in that doomed conference room 3 months ago. That's what I proved. And that's what I'll keep proving, one contract at a time, until it becomes so obvious that no one even thinks to test it. Director Chen smiled. Then I suppose we'd better get to work. You have 12 contracts to negotiate. 6 months after the handshake collapse, Ava Monroe was named to Forbes' list of the world's most powerful women, with a citation that read, Monroe didn't just pull $2.4 billion from a discriminatory company, she rewrote the rules about corporate accountability. Victoria Sloan settled into a bitter retirement, her name becoming synonymous with the dangers of unchecked prejudice. Sloan Industries' assets were purchased by 3 different companies, each of which implemented strict anti-discrimination policies and diverse leadership teams. Thomas Kincaid, the COO who'd provided the evidence that sealed Victoria's fate, became Chief Operating Officer at Monroe Capital, where he helped implement the firm's expansion into manufacturing sector investments. The Monroe Clause became industry standard in major investment deals, protecting both investors and employees from discriminatory leadership. And Ava? She continued building her empire, one handshake at a time, each one offered freely, each one a reminder that in her world, respect wasn't negotiable. It was simply the price of admission.
And that's it for today's story. Thanks so much for sticking with me until the end. If you enjoyed this, show some love by hitting like and subscribing. It really does make a huge difference. Ready for more? I've got another incredible story waiting for you right now. Click the video on your screen and let's keep going. Catch you there.